Before Marcus could formulate a response to that absolute truth bomb, a heavy, scraping thud echoed from the hallway. I snapped my head around to see one of the burly movers casually hoisting my antique cherry wood side table onto his shoulder. It was a flawless 19th century piece that Beatrice had left exclusively to me, a family heirloom worth more than the mover's entire commercial truck. My calm, quiet demeanor vanished instantly. The practiced clinical detachment of a corporate attorney took over. "Put that down," I commanded. My voice did not raise in volume, but the absolute ice in my tone froze the entire room. The mover paused, looking over his shoulder with a bored, dismissive expression. "Lady, I just take orders from the guy paying the bill." He jerked his chin toward Richard, who was standing near the doorway looking incredibly pleased with the destruction of my sanctuary. "He says the house is his, so the furniture goes to the curb." I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out my leather card holder. With a single fluid motion, I extracted my official State Bar Association card. The gold seal caught the bright morning light streaming through the bay windows as I slammed it down onto the marble kitchen island with a sharp crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot. "I am a senior partner, specializing in real estate and corporate litigation," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal, terrifying precision. "That side table is my legally documented personal property. If you take one more step toward that front door with it, you are committing grand larceny. I will not only press felony charges against you personally, but I will personally sue your moving company into complete, unrecoverable bankruptcy by the end of the business week. Now put my property down." The mover stared at the gold seal on the bar card, then looked up at my unwavering glare. The color rapidly drained from his face as the legal threat registered. He gently, almost gingerly lowered the antique side table back onto the floor, smoothing out an invisible scratch on the polished wood before backing away with his hands raised in total surrender. "Hey man, I am not getting involved in a legal dispute," the head mover announced, stepping back and sharply signaling his crew to stop working. "We were hired for a standard residential cleanout. We are not touching another single box or piece of furniture until you people figure out who actually owns this place." Brenda let out a sound that was half shriek, half gasp. She lunged forward, her pristine white tennis shoes squeaking loudly against the floorboards. "She is lying." Brenda shrieked, pointing a manicured, trembling finger at my bar card. "She bought that fake piece of plastic online. She is a high school dropout who paints houses for minimum wage. Do not listen to her. She is just trying to stall so she can steal my daughter's house." Vanessa immediately joined the chorus of absolute delusion. She stomped her designer sneakers so hard the floorboards vibrated under the force of her adult temper tantrum. "Marcus, do something," she wailed, her face twisting into a petulant mask of spoiled fury. "She is ruining my house." "Kick her out," Dad said. "The house is mine, so make her leave right now." Vanessa expected her husband to step up to physically intimidate me, or to at least yell. She expected him to be the blunt instrument her family always used to enforce their toxic will. But Marcus remained completely frozen. He stared at my bar card resting on the marble, then stared at the sheer, undeniable panic radiating from Richard. Marcus was an established businessman. He dealt with zoning lawyers and city planners every single day. He knew exactly what a real bar card looked like, and he knew exactly what a guilty cornered man looked like. He slowly lowered his metal clipboard, refusing to meet Vanessa's furious, demanding gaze. Seeing his prized son-in-law refuse to act, Richard decided to play his final desperate trump card. His face was a mask of furious, sweating indignation as he yanked his latest model smartphone from his tailored slacks. "Fine," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing with the hollow bravado of a cornered, desperate animal. "You want to play lawyer, Chloe? Let us play lawyer. I have the signed deed. I have the power of attorney. I am the sole legal owner of this estate." He aggressively tapped 3 numbers into his phone and held it up high for the entire room to see a smug, victorious grin spreading across his flushed, angry face as the speakerphone loudly dialed 911. "Let us see how you talk your way out of trespassing when the real cops show up to drag you out of here in handcuffs," Richard sneered, fully believing his own manufactured reality. You are going to leave this house today, even if I have to watch you get thrown into the back of a squad car to do it." I did not flinch. I did not move to stop him or beg for mercy. Instead, I simply picked up my espresso cup, took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of the dark roast, and offered my father a chillingly bright smile. "By all means, Dad, call them," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying effortlessly over the rhythmic ringing tone of the emergency line. "But while you have dispatch on the phone, make sure you explicitly tell them to send the financial fraud unit. They are going to need a whole lot of evidence bags for the felonies you just proudly brought into my living room." Richard's thumb hovered over his smartphone screen, his face flushing a deeper, more dangerous shade of crimson, but he pressed the call button anyway. He spoke rapidly to the emergency dispatcher, his voice dropping an octave to project a false sense of weary calm. He requested immediate police assistance for a hostile trespasser, entirely ignoring my warning about the fraud unit. When he finally ended the call, a thick, suffocating tension settled over my living room. The moving crew had already retreated to the safety of their truck, leaving just my toxic family standing awkwardly among my carefully curated furniture. Brenda, completely unable to endure silence, decided to use the waiting period to launch a psychological assault. She paced the length of my Persian rug, her eyes darting around the room before locking onto me with absolute venom. "You know, Chloe, this defiant little act of yours perfectly explains why you are 33 years old and completely alone," Brenda sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her pristine white tennis outfit. "Look at you. You have no husband, no children, and absolutely no prospects. You hoard this massive empty house because you have literally nothing else in your pathetic life. You are cold. You are hard. You lack any basic feminine warmth. Look at Vanessa. She is happily married to a successful, hardworking man. She knows how to build a real family. All you know how to do is play dress-up and pretend you are important. No man will ever want a woman who behaves like an arrogant, stubborn squatter." Vanessa snickered, leaning heavily against Marcus, who remained rigidly stiff and silent. He was staring at the floorboards, clearly wishing he was anywhere else on the planet, his grip tightening on his metal clipboard. I did not offer Brenda the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not raise my voice, cry, or defend my relationship status. Instead, I simply turned my back on her and walked over to my high-end Italian espresso machine. I picked up a fresh handful of dark roasted beans, poured them into the hopper, and turned on the grinder. The loud, harsh whirring noise completely drowned out whatever insulting follow-up Brenda was attempting to deliver. I carefully tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into place, and watched the rich, dark liquid pour into a clean ceramic cup. I added a splash of oat milk, took a slow, deliberate sip, and turned back to face them, just as the bright flash of red and blue lights illuminated the front bay windows. Two police officers walked heavily up my front steps. One was an older, weary-looking veteran, and the other was a younger rookie who kept a hand resting nervously near his utility belt. Before I could even set my espresso cup down, Richard threw the front door wide open and intercepted them. He instantly dropped the aggressive, bullying persona he had been using just minutes prior. In a split second, he transformed into a masterful, Oscar-worthy portrayal of a heartbroken, exhausted father dealing with an impossible family tragedy. "Officers, thank you so much for arriving so quickly," Richard said, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. He ran a hand through his graying hair, looking pleadingly at the older cop. "I am so sorry to waste your valuable time, but we are dealing with a deeply unfortunate family situation. My mother recently passed away. It has been incredibly hard on all of us, but especially on my older daughter, Chloe." He gestured toward me with a sorrowful, dramatic shake of his head. "She has been staying here," Richard continued, his tone practically dripping with fake paternal concern. "She is mentally unstable and simply refuses to accept that her grandmother is gone. She has completely detached from reality. I am the legal owner of this estate, and I am just trying to transition the property peacefully so my younger daughter can move in and start her family. But Chloe is becoming hostile. She is claiming she owns the place. We just need her removed before she hurts herself or someone else." The older officer sighed, a look of tired sympathy crossing his weathered face. He had clearly responded to dozens of messy, emotional family disputes just like this one. He stepped into the foyer holding his hand out toward Richard. "Sir, do you have documentation proving that you are the legal owner of this residence?" the officer asked politely but firmly. "Absolutely," Richard replied eagerly. He practically shoved the crumpled stack of papers into the officer's hands. "Here is the quitclaim deed, and here is the full power of attorney my mother signed over to me just before she died. It gives me absolute control over her entire estate, including this property." The officer adjusted his belt and spent a long moment reviewing the cheap downloaded legal forms. He flipped from the first page to the second, his eyes scanning the generic paragraphs. Vanessa smirked, whispering something victorious to Brenda, who was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. The officer finally looked up from the papers and turned his attention to me. His expression was not angry, but it was strictly authoritative. "Ma'am, I understand that losing a family member is incredibly difficult," the officer said, taking a slow step toward the kitchen island. "But your father holds the power of attorney, and he has the deed transfer right here. Legally speaking, this is his property. You do not have the right to remain here against his wishes. I'm going to have to ask you to go pack your essential belongings and vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse, this becomes a trespassing issue, and I will have no choice but to place you under arrest." Brenda let out a loud, triumphant gasp. "I told you," she crowed, pointing a sharp finger at me. "Go get your garbage bags, Chloe." I did not argue with the police officer. I did not raise my voice, launch into a defensive rant, or beg for understanding. I simply set my ceramic espresso cup down on the marble counter with a soft clink. "Officers, if you would please step this way," I said politely, gesturing with an open hand toward the back hallway of the house. "I promise it will only take a moment of your time." Richard barked a harsh laugh. "Do not listen to her. She is just stalling." But the older officer, perhaps intrigued by my absolute lack of panic, nodded to his rookie partner and followed me down the wide, sunlit corridor. My family trailed closely behind the officers, muttering angry protests, completely unable to contain their furious curiosity. I led the group past the dining room, past the grand staircase, and entered my private home office. It was a beautiful, meticulously organized room featuring a massive hand-carved mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with heavy legal texts, and a massive industrial-grade steel fireproof safe bolted directly into the foundation in the corner of the room. I ignored my family entirely. I walked straight to the corner of the room, crouched down, and spun the combination dial on the heavy steel safe. The intricate locking mechanism clicked smoothly into place. I pulled the heavy door open, reached inside, and extracted a thick, professionally bound legal folio bearing the official embossed gold seal of the state. I stood up, walked over to the mahogany desk, and gently placed the thick document directly in front of the older police officer. "Officers, my father is holding a forgery," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute authority. "Here is the actual irrevocable trust registered and stamped by a federal judge 5 years ago." The older officer adjusted his heavy duty belt and leaned forward, squinting down at the documents laid out before him on the mahogany desk. Beside him, the younger rookie shifted his weight, his eyes darting from the embossed seal of my irrevocable trust back to the crumpled cheap printouts Richard had shoved at them earlier. "Let me make this incredibly simple," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, maintaining the absolute calm of a seasoned attorney, explaining basic law to a hostile opposing counsel. "The document my father handed you, the supposed power of attorney, he claims grants him ownership of this property, is dated August 14th. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the date stamped in smeared blue ink near the bottom of Richard's fake paperwork. "My grandmother, Beatrice Thorne, the original owner of this estate, passed away on August 12th at exactly 6:14 in the morning." I continued, my voice steady, betraying none of the deep, lingering grief I still carried for her. "I have the official death certificate filed with the state right here in my safe if you need to verify the timeline." The older officer's thick eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked from my finger back down to the date on Richard's document, his lips moving silently as he mentally checked the math. So I concluded unless my father recently developed the ability to hold a seance and coerce a dead woman into signing a legal document from beyond the grave, he has just willingly handed a sworn law enforcement officer a blatantly forged legal document in an attempt to commit real estate fraud. In this state, gentlemen, that is a second-degree felony. The shift in the room was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying to witness. The weary, sympathetic expression the older officer had worn when he walked through the door completely vanished, replaced by a hard, unyielding stare. The rookie, clearly realizing they had just walked into a massive, premeditated fraud attempt rather than a standard domestic squabble, stiffened his posture and rested his hand firmly near his radio. They both looked at Richard's printouts one last time, verifying the glaring, undeniably fake date. Then, without saying a single word to me, they turned in perfect synchronization and marched back out of the home office and into the brightly lit living room. Richard, Brenda, and Vanessa were still clustered near the foyer. Brenda was practically bouncing on the balls of her feet, clearly anticipating the moment the officers would return to physically drag me out the front door. Vanessa had her phone out, clearly recording the encounter for her social media, preparing to broadcast my humiliation to her thousands of fake followers. "Well," Richard asked eagerly, puffing out his chest and attempting to look like the reasonable, exhausted patriarch again. "Is she packing her bags, or do I need to hire a professional hazmat crew to clear out the mess she is leaving behind?" The older officer did not smile. He stopped directly in front of Richard, his expression carved from stone. He held out the forged power of attorney between his thumb and forefinger, treating it like a piece of contaminated garbage. "Sir, the homeowner in there has just provided indisputable federally registered proof of absolute ownership," the officer said, his voice loud enough to echo off the high ceilings. "She also provided indisputable proof that the document you handed me is a forgery, considering the signatory had been legally dead for 2 days before this date was stamped." The smug grin melted off Richard's face faster than snow on a hot grill. He opened his mouth and closed it, looking like a fish suffocating on dry land. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. Brenda stopped bouncing. Her jaw dropped. "That is impossible," she shrieked, pointing at the closed office door. "She is lying. She probably printed that fake trust thing off the internet. She is a liar." "Ma'am," the younger officer snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Brenda physically flinch. "The document in that safe has a state seal and a federal judge's signature. The document your husband handed us was printed on copy paper with a forged date. I highly suggest you lower your voice." Richard tried to step backward, his hands coming up in a frantic, placating gesture. "Officers, there must be a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "The lawyer I used, he must have messed up the dates. I can call him right now. Let me just make a quick phone call and we can clear this whole thing up." "You can make whatever phone calls you want from the sidewalk," the older officer interrupted, his hand moving to rest deliberately on his radio. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get your family, your moving crew, and your vehicles entirely off this property before you are placed under arrest for presenting forged legal documentation to an officer of the law and criminal trespassing." Vanessa let out a strangled, terrified gasp, dropping her cell phone onto the Persian rug. The device landed face down with a sickening crunch, the screen shattering instantly. But my designer Vanessa wailed, ignoring her broken phone and grabbing onto her father's arm. "He is going to be here any minute. We already paid the deposit. Where are we supposed to put my new furniture?" Richard ignored his daughter's screeching. He stared at the two officers, realizing the absolute finality of his situation. He looked past them, catching my eye as I stepped casually out of the home office. I was leaning against the doorframe, sipping my espresso, watching his entire manufactured reality collapse around his expensive leather loafers. "We are leaving," Richard muttered, his voice shaking with a pathetic, defeated tremor. "We are leaving right now. Do not arrest me, please." He turned and bolted for the front door, practically sprinting past the confused waiting movers. Brenda scrambled after him, abandoning her usual haughty strut and jogging awkwardly in her pristine white tennis outfit, completely forgetting her designer handbag resting on the kitchen island. Vanessa stood frozen in the middle of the room, looking wildly between the officers, the shattered remains of her phone and me. She looked like a toddler whose favorite toy had just been snatched away. She stomped her foot again, opened her mouth to scream, and then finally realized her parents had completely abandoned her. She let out a frustrated sob, spun on her heel, and ran out the door after them. The front door slammed shut, leaving an absolute ringing silence in its wake. The heavy toxic energy that had suffocated the house moments before completely evaporated, replaced by the quiet, peaceful morning light streaming through the stained glass. I walked slowly into the living room, feeling the tension finally drain from my shoulders. The older officer turned to me, offering a respectful nod. "I am sorry you had to deal with that, ma'am," he said quietly. "We will wait outside until they are completely off the street. Do you want us to file a formal report regarding the forgery?" I looked at the crumpled fake document the officer had placed back on the coffee table. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the theft of my college fund, and the sheer, unadulterated cruelty my father and stepmother had inflicted upon me my entire life. "Yes, please," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I want everything documented, and please make sure to include the name of the moving company they hired. I plan on having my firm subpoena their financial records by tomorrow morning." The officer offered a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Understood, counselor. You have a good day." As the officers exited the house, I turned back to the kitchen island. Marcus, who had remained completely silent and perfectly still during the entire confrontation, was still standing there. He had not run out with Vanessa. He had not followed Richard. He was staring at me, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and dawning comprehension. The heavy, professionally bound legal folio hit the mahogany desk with a resounding, undeniable thud. The older police officer adjusted his duty belt, leaned forward, and opened the crisp, watermarked pages. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, completely ignoring the escalating panic radiating from my father. The officer's gaze lingered deliberately on the heavy gold seal and the unmistakable bold signature of a federal judge. The room plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence, save for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched Richard. His face, previously flushed with manufactured, arrogant indignation, suddenly drained of all color, leaving him looking like a sick gray ghost. His jaw literally dropped. His mouth hung open in a slack, panicked circle as the realization of his catastrophic miscalculation finally hit him. He had banked his entire grift on the assumption that Grandmother Beatrice had left her affairs messy, that I was disorganized, and that his cheap internet printout would be enough to bully a grieving woman into submission. The older officer closed the folio, tapped it once respectfully, and looked at Richard. The weary, sympathetic expression the cop had worn when he walked through the front door had completely vanished, replaced by a hard, unyielding stare of professional disgust. The younger rookie, clearly realizing they had just walked into a premeditated real estate scam rather than a standard family squabble, stiffened his posture and rested his hand firmly near his radio. Brenda, however, was fundamentally incapable of processing defeat or reading a room. The second the older officer shot Richard that icy glare, Brenda snapped. She launched herself forward, her face twisting into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "This is a setup!" Brenda shrieked, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch that practically rattled the glass in the antique bay windows. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the older officer's face. "You are colluding with her. I know exactly how you people operate. You walk into a nice, wealthy neighborhood, you see a young woman playing the victim, and you completely ignore the actual law-abiding property owners." "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step back," the younger officer warned, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Do not tell me to step back," Brenda howled, stepping even closer, completely disregarding the officer's command. "I want your badge numbers. Both of them. Right now. Do you have any idea who we are? My husband is a highly prominent businessman. We are personal friends with the mayor and the chief of police. I will have you both fired and stripped of your pensions by tomorrow morning for treating us like common street criminals." The older officer did not even blink. He did not reach for his notebook or offer an apology. He simply crossed his arms over his chest. "Ma'am, the only crime being committed in this room today is the presentation of forged legal documents to sworn law enforcement." The older officer stated, his voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of fear. "I strongly advise you to stop screaming before I decide to add disorderly conduct to the list of potential felony charges your husband is currently facing." The threat of arrest finally pierced through Brenda's thick bubble of delusion. She snapped her mouth shut, her eyes darting nervously as she took a staggering step backward. But the sudden vacuum of silence she left behind was instantly filled by Vanessa. My younger sister had been standing near the doorway, watching her guaranteed unearned inheritance evaporate into thin air. Her bottom lip began to tremble. Her eyes filled with large, dramatic, perfectly manufactured tears. And then, right on cue, the golden child threw a massive, spectacular adult temper tantrum. "No," Vanessa wailed, stomping her expensive designer sneaker against the hardwood floor so hard the floorboards vibrated. "No, no, no. This is completely unfair." She spun around and threw herself at Marcus, grabbing handfuls of his heavy cotton work shirt. She shook him, her face totally contorted with spoiled, petulant fury. "Marcus, do something, make them stop." "This is my house," Vanessa screamed, burying her face into his chest. "Dad promised me this house. He told me it was mine. We already paid the contractors for the full remodel. We cannot lose this property." "Marcus, I already picked out the imported Italian tile for the master bathroom." Marcus stood completely frozen. He did not wrap his large arms around his hysterical wife. He did not utter a single soothing word of comfort. His calloused hands remained stiffly at his sides. He stared at the tears streaming down Vanessa's face, but he was not looking at her with sympathy. He was looking at her like he was seeing a stranger. The gears in his mind were turning with agonizing clarity, finally piecing together the massive foundational lies his in-laws had built their entire lives upon. I had watched this exact theatrical performance play out 1,000 times throughout my childhood. Vanessa crying, demanding, and throwing a fit until someone bent to her toxic will. But we were not children anymore, and I was entirely done letting her manipulate reality. I stepped away from the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Paid what contractors, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice slicing through her hysterical sobs like a freshly sharpened scalpel. Vanessa froze, slowly letting go of Marcus's shirt. She glared at me, her chest heaving, thick black mascara running in ugly streaks down her flushed cheeks. "We paid them," she spat viciously. "We gave them the deposit." "No, Vanessa." I corrected, enunciating every single syllable with lethal clinical precision. "You did not pay anyone a single dime. You have not worked a single day in your entire adult life. You do not have a career. You do not have an independent income. Marcus works 60-hour weeks on grueling, dangerous construction sites to fund your endless shopping addiction and your desperate, pathetic need to look wealthy. Marcus pays the bills. You just spend his hard-earned money to play pretend." "How dare you speak to her that way?" Brenda gasped, clutching her chest in a textbook display of manufactured outrage. "I am simply stating the absolute documented truth," I replied smoothly, never taking my eyes off my trembling sister. "Dad promised you an estate he never owned, and you happily spent your husband's money remodeling a property you never had a legal right to touch. You are all living in a fantasy world, and the final bill just came due." Vanessa opened her mouth to scream another defense, to launch another volley of insults, but a heavy, commanding voice cut her off completely. "Shut up, Vanessa." The words were spoken softly, but they carried a terrifying heavy weight. Everyone in the room turned to look at Marcus. The quiet, patient, endlessly accommodating builder had finally reached his absolute breaking point. His face, usually open and friendly, had hardened into a mask of pure, uncompromising granite. He gently but firmly peeled Vanessa's clinging hands off his shirt, stepping away from her as if she were suddenly contagious. He did not look at her again. Instead, he slowly turned his massive frame to face my father. Richard swallowed hard, instinctively taking a step backward. The smug, confident patriarch had completely vanished, replaced by a sweating, terrified con artist who realized his mark had finally caught on to the game. Marcus took one slow, deliberate step toward Richard. The air in the room grew incredibly thick, vibrating with impending violence. "Wait a minute," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room, including the two police officers. He stared directly into Richard's wide, terrified eyes, completely ignoring the fake legal documents, ignoring Brenda's panicked breathing, and ignoring his wife's continued sobbing. "If you do not own this house," Marcus began, emphasizing each word with terrifying, methodical clarity. "If you never had the deed, and you never had the legal right to give this property to Vanessa, then what the hell did I just take out a $150,000 second mortgage to pay you for last week?" The absolute silence that slammed into my living room was so profound it felt heavy, pressing down on everyone present with the weight of a physical blow. The air itself seemed to freeze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the distant, muffled hum of the moving truck idling out on the street. The two police officers who had been halfway out the front door stopped dead in their tracks. The older officer slowly pivoted on his heel, his hand dropping away from the brass doorknob. The weary irritation he had displayed earlier was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, hyper-focused intensity of a law enforcement professional realizing a simple trespassing call had just escalated into a massive financial crime. The younger rookie mirrored his partner, immediately reaching for the small notepad tucked into his breast pocket. They recognized the scent of a major felony, and Richard was bleeding it from every pore. I stood by the mahogany desk, my eyes narrowing, as the final missing pieces of this chaotic puzzle snapped violently into place. The sudden, frantic urgency to get me out of the house. The incredibly sloppy, hastily forged legal Zoom documents. The reckless decision to bring a moving crew and the police into a situation that would inevitably expose their lies. It had never made sense to me. Richard was a grifter, but he was usually a careful one. He preferred subtle manipulation and long-term emotional abuse over blatant, easily disprovable felonies. But desperate men make sloppy mistakes. And a man trying to cover up the theft of $150,000 from his own son-in-law was a very desperate man. Marcus did not blink. He stared down at my father, his broad chest rising and falling with slow, dangerously controlled breaths. The physical disparity between the two men had never been more apparent. Marcus was built from years of pouring concrete and lifting steel, a man of solid, uncompromising labor. Richard was soft manicured and currently shrinking inside his tailored designer suit. "You told me you needed that money to clear the liens on this estate," Marcus said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, vibrating growl that resonated through the floorboards. "You sat at my kitchen table, looked me dead in the eye, and told me that Chloe had completely neglected the property taxes and run the estate into the ground. You said there were outstanding debts preventing the legal transfer of the deed. You promised me that if I gave you $150,000 in cash, you could clear the liens and transfer the deed to Vanessa cleanly by the end of the week. You said it was an investment in our future." Vanessa let out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She had wanted a free mansion to show off to her country club friends. The sudden realization that her husband had leveraged their own home, taking on massive, crushing debt to buy it, shattered her entitled fantasy. "Marcus, you took out a second mortgage on our house," Vanessa whimpered, her voice cracking with actual panic. "You put our home in debt for this." Marcus ignored her completely, keeping his dark, furious gaze locked onto Richard. "I wired the funds directly into your personal account 4 days ago, Richard. Where is my money?" Richard began to sweat profusely. The beads of moisture gathered on his forehead and upper lip gleaming under the bright, recessed lighting of the living room. His eyes darted frantically around the room, landing anywhere but on the two police officers who were now watching him with predatory interest. The lifelong con artist instinctively fell back on his only defense mechanism. He began to gaslight. "Marcus, son, you are overreacting," Richard stammered, raising his hands in a placating, defensive gesture. He forced a sickeningly fake, patronizing chuckle, desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy patriarch managing a misunderstanding. You simply do not understand how high-level real estate transitions work. It is a very complex process. There are temporary cash flow issues that arise during estate liquidations. I took those funds and placed them into secure business investments to maximize our leverage before we dealt with the city zoning board. He tugged nervously at his silk tie, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. It was just a temporary reallocation of resources. Richard continued, his voice pitching higher as the lie spun out of his control. A bridge loan, really. You have to trust me, Marcus. We are family. I am managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio here, and you are getting upset over standard administrative logistics. The money is perfectly safe in a holding account. The older police officer stepped forward, the heavy thud of his boots cutting through Richard's pathetic excuses. Sir, the officer warned, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You are currently standing in front of sworn law enforcement, attempting to explain away a six-figure wire transfer obtained under what appears to be highly fraudulent pretenses. I strongly advise you to choose your next words with extreme caution because everything you are saying is being officially documented. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He looked at his wife for help, but Brenda had backed away until she hit the wall, her face hidden behind her hands. The facade of extreme wealth and untouchable privilege they had spent decades building was turning to ash right in front of them. I stepped out from the hallway, walking slowly into the center of the living room. My silk robe brushed against the Persian rug, and the crisp, undeniable truth hung heavy on my tongue. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a worthless failure, and I felt nothing but cold, clinical pity. There are no liens on this house, Marcus, I stated clearly, ensuring the police officers heard every single word. There have never been any liens on this property. My grandmother left this estate completely debt-free, and I own it free and clear. I have paid the property taxes in full a month early every single year for the past 5 years. Marcus turned his head to look at me, the final remnants of his trust in his father-in-law shattering in his dark eyes. Dad did not take your money for a house. I continued, turning my gaze back to Richard, watching his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. He did not put your $150,000 into a holding account, and there are no complex business investments. He took your money to pay off his loan sharks. He has been hiding his financial ruin from all of you for years, but the game is over. He is completely irrevocably bankrupt. The word bankrupt hung in the air like a physical curse. It was the absolute worst insult, the ultimate dirty word in my family's shallow status-obsessed vocabulary. For a fraction of a second, the living room was entirely devoid of sound. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to cease. The two police officers stood silently by the front door, exchanging a sharp, knowing look. They had arrived expecting a routine squatter removal, but they were now standing on the precipice of a massive, multi-layered financial crime. They crossed their arms and waited, letting the self-destruction play out. Brenda was the first to break the heavy silence. She let out a sharp, erratic gasp, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. She instinctively pulled her oversized, ridiculously expensive designer handbag tight against her chest, clutching the leather like a protective shield against the ugly truth. Her perfectly injected face contorted into a mask of aggressive, frantic denial. "You are a liar!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. She pointed a manicured finger at my face, her hand trembling violently. "Do not listen to a single word she says. Marcus, she is lying. She is making all of this up because she is a miserable, jealous spinster. She has always hated us. She has always hated our success." Brenda took a step toward Marcus, reaching out as if to physically steer him away from the undeniable reality of his situation. "Richard is a giant in this community." Brenda wailed, her volume increasing with every word. "We are wealthy. We are successful. Chloe is just a bitter, lonely squatter trying to tear this family apart because she has absolutely nothing of her own. Look at her. She is sick in the head." I did not even blink. I just watched her unravel. I watched the decades of carefully curated, expensive lies burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. Marcus did not look at Brenda. He did not look at Richard. He completely ignored the frantic, screeching woman trying to claw at his sleeve. His entire world had forcefully narrowed down to the crying, trembling woman standing directly in front of him. The woman he had married. The woman he had taken on 6 figures of debt to please. Marcus stepped forward and grabbed Vanessa by the shoulders. His large, calloused working hands gripped the delicate fabric of her designer blouse. He did not shake her, but the sheer restrained power in his grip made Vanessa gasp in shock. "Did you know about this?" Marcus demanded. His voice was no longer a shout. It was a low, terrifying rumble vibrating with a fury that went deeper than bone. Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head rapidly back and forth. Marcus gave her a single firm jolt, forcing her to open her eyes and look at him. "I asked you a question," Vanessa Marcus growled, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. "I want the truth. Did you know about this? Did you know your father did not own this house? Did you know he was scamming me to pay off his personal debts?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but only a pathetic, high-pitched squeak came out. She looked frantically toward Richard, then toward Brenda, silently begging her parents to step in and save her, to weave another magical lie that would make the consequences disappear. But Richard was staring at the floor, sweating profusely, paralyzed by the presence of the police officers. Brenda was still clutching her handbag, hyperventilating. The golden child was entirely on her own. Marcus leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "You pushed me for weeks to sign that second mortgage paperwork," he stated, his tone dripping with a devastating, heartbreaking realization. "You cried. You begged. You told me it was the only way we could secure our future. You watched me put our actual home, the house I built, with my own 2 hands on the line for your father. Did you know it was a scam?" The intense, uncompromising pressure of his demand was simply too much for Vanessa. She had never been held accountable for a single action in her entire life. Faced with the furious, betrayed gaze of the husband she had just financially ruined, the golden child completely and utterly crumbled. She burst into loud, ugly tears. Her carefully applied makeup ran in thick, dark rivers down her face. She let out a loud wail, ripping herself out of Marcus's grip and taking a staggering step backward. And exactly as she had done since she was a toddler, Vanessa instantly threw the blame onto someone else. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at her mother. "Mom made me do it!" Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceilings. "I did not want to. I told her it was a bad idea, but Mom made me do it." Brenda gasped, looking genuinely horrified, as her prized daughter threw her directly under the proverbial bus. Brenda hissed. "Shut your mouth." "I will not shut up," Vanessa shrieked, stomping her foot, completely reverting to a petulant child. She turned her tear-streaked face back to Marcus, pleading for his understanding. "She told me Dad was in trouble. She said the business accounts were completely empty and the bank was going to take their house. She told me that if we did not give Dad the money to pay off the men he borrowed from, the entire business would go under." Vanessa paused, gasping for air, seemingly oblivious to the incredibly damning nature of her own confession. "She said if Dad went bankrupt, they would have to cut off my supplemental credit cards." Vanessa wailed, clutching her chest as if she were the ultimate victim of a great tragedy. "She said they would stop paying the lease on my luxury SUV. What was I supposed to do, Marcus? I cannot lose my credit cards. I have a lifestyle to maintain. You do not make enough to cover my monthly expenses. I had to help them so they could keep funding me." The absolute silence returned to the room, heavier and more suffocating than before. The sheer, breathtaking selfishness of her statement hung in the air. Vanessa had actively participated in a massive financial scam against her own husband, risking the roof over his head simply to ensure her parents could continue funding her designer shopping addiction. Marcus stared at his wife. The anger in his expression slowly vanished, replaced by a look of absolute devastating betrayal. It was the look of a man watching his entire life, his marriage and his trust shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The realization that he was tied to a parasite hit him with physical force. He dropped his hands from Vanessa as if her very presence burned his skin. He took a long, deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the toxic nightmare he had married into. Marcus Vanessa whimpered, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. Marcus, please, you have to understand. I was just trying to protect my lifestyle. Marcus did not answer her. He reached into the back pocket of his heavy denim work jeans and pulled out his smartphone. His face was a mask of cold, uncompromising granite. He unlocked the screen, his calloused thumb tapping aggressively against the glass. I am calling the bank to freeze all our joint accounts, Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Right now. Marcus pressed the phone to his ear. The dial tone echoed faintly in the cavernous, deadly quiet living room. He did not spare another glance at his wife. Vanessa was still crumpled on the floor, weeping into her hands, waiting for someone to rush to her aid. No one did. Her performative sobbing, which had controlled the emotional weather of her household for her entire life, suddenly had zero currency. Marcus turned his back on her completely. He took a heavy, decisive step away from the chaotic cluster of my so-called family. With slow, purposeful strides, he crossed the invisible battle line that had been drawn through the center of my home. He walked directly over to my side of the mahogany desk, planting his work boots firmly on the floor. It was a physical and symbolic severing of ties. He was officially standing with the enemy of the family. He looked down at me. The rigid, stoic mask he had worn for years finally cracked, revealing a man absolutely gutted by betrayal. I am so sorry, Chloe, Marcus said. His voice was thick with a mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. I had no idea they were this evil. I thought I was building a future for my wife. I thought I was helping her family transition a clean real estate deal. I trusted him because he was her father. I never would have participated in trying to steal your home. I looked at the large, exhausted contractor. For the first time in my life, I felt a genuine surge of empathy for someone connected to Vanessa. He was just another victim of their relentless, glittering grift. They had exploited his working-class work ethic and his desire to provide, milking him dry to sustain a lifestyle they could not afford. You were conned, Marcus, I replied, my tone softening just a fraction for him. They have spent their entire lives perfecting this act. You are just the first person who actually had the capital they needed to steal. Across the room, the reality of Marcus's phone call was finally piercing through Richard's panic-paralyzed brain. If Marcus froze those joint accounts, if he alerted the bank's fraud department while the wire transfer was still potentially pending or processing, the house of cards would not just collapse. It would catch fire. The loan sharks would not get their money. Or worse, the bank would trace the routing numbers and alert federal authorities. The carefully curated illusion of Richard as a titan of industry was moments away from becoming a very public, very humiliating criminal indictment. Richard let out a desperate, guttural sound. It was the noise of a trapped animal realizing the cage door was permanently locked. He threw caution and self-preservation completely out the window. Richard lunged forward. He scrambled across the Persian rug, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the fabric, his hands outstretched like hooked claws. He aimed directly for the cell phone pressed against Marcus's ear. He was entirely consumed by the frantic need to disconnect the call, to stop the financial freeze, to maintain control for just one more minute. He never even made it halfway. The older police officer moved with a speed and practiced aggression that completely defied his graying hair. He stepped directly into Richard's path, planting his heavy black boots firmly on the hardwood. As Richard charged blindly forward, the officer raised his hands and delivered a hard, forceful shove squarely against the center of Richard's tailored suit jacket. The impact sent my father stumbling backward violently. He lost his footing, his arms pinwheeling in the air, and he crashed hard into the wall next to the entryway. His elbow slammed against the plaster, knocking a heavy, framed landscape painting to the floor with a loud, shattering crack that made Vanessa scream again. "Back up, sir," the older officer barked. His hand was resting meaningfully on his utility belt, hovering right over his handcuffs. The warning in his eyes was absolute and deadly serious. "Keep your hands to yourself." If you make another sudden move toward anyone in this room, I will put you in irons and drag you out of this house in front of every single neighbor on this street. Do you understand me? Richard slid down the wall slightly, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The wind had been knocked completely out of his lungs, both physically and metaphorically. He stared up at the officer, his face pale and slick with sweat, finally nodding his head in terrified, humiliating submission. Brenda let out a high-pitched shriek, rushing to her husband's side, acting as if he had just been shot. She fluttered her hands over him, glaring venomously at the police, but she wisely kept her mouth shut. The reality of physical force had finally penetrated her bubble of entitlement. I turned my attention back to Marcus. He was speaking quietly into his phone, providing his account numbers and security pins to the bank representative on the emergency line. I watched him explicitly instruct the bank to lock down every single line of credit, every checking account, and every savings pool he shared with Vanessa. I waited patiently, watching the color drain from Vanessa's face as she listened to her husband systematically cut off her lifeblood. When he finally ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, the room felt charged with static electricity. This was the moment. The foundation of their lies was completely exposed, but I needed to rip the plumbing out of the walls. I needed to dismantle the facade so thoroughly that they could never ever rebuild it. I needed the final piece of the puzzle. "Marcus," I said, pitching my voice to carry clearly across the quiet room. "When Richard convinced you to take out that second mortgage, how exactly did he ask you to send the funds?" "He did not ask for a personal check, did he?" Marcus shook his head, his brow furrowing as he recalled the transaction. "No. He said personal checks would cause unnecessary delays with the city zoning board. He insisted on a direct wire transfer." To where I asked, stepping closer. "He is bankrupt. He does not have a functional business account that is not currently being monitored by creditors. Where did you send the $150,000? Marcus rubbed his temples, the stress of the day visibly weighing on him. He gave me the routing information for a holding company. He said it was an escrow trust, specifically set up for estate transitions to avoid capital gains taxes. What was the exact name of the company, Marcus? I pressed, pulling my sleek silver iPad from the top drawer of the mahogany desk. I woke the screen and tapped the icon for the state's corporate registry database. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking back to the wire transfer forms he had signed just 4 days ago. It was called Horizon Apex Ventures. He told me it was a subsidiary of his main firm. I typed the name Horizon Apex Ventures into the search bar on my screen. I did not just have access to standard public records. Thanks to my grandmother's extensive financial planning and the forensic accountant she had hired years ago to untangle my father's previous messes, I had access to a highly detailed database of known shell corporations, flagged accounts, and blacklisted entities. I hit enter. The screen loaded instantly, pulling up a dense wall of text, corporate filings, and registered agents. I scanned the lines quickly, my eyes darting across the dates of incorporation, the listed addresses, and the names associated with the holding company. A slow, icy realization washed over me, immediately followed by a wave of dark, vindictive satisfaction. The sheer blinding arrogance of my father was truly a marvel to behold. He had not just stolen money from his son-in-law to pay off loan sharks. He had dragged Marcus directly into a federal crime. I let out a dark, knowing laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the walls and made Brenda flinch visibly. "Oh, Marcus," I said, lifting my gaze from the glowing screen of the iPad to meet his exhausted eyes. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "It is worse than you think." I turned the screen around so Marcus could see the bright red flags and warning banners attached to the corporate filing. I pointed directly at the registered agent's name. "You did not just give them a loan," I stated, making sure every syllable landed like a hammer strike. "Horizon Apex Ventures is not an escrow trust. It is a known shell company currently under active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for laundering money for offshore syndicates. You unwittingly became an accessory to corporate embezzlement." Marcus stared at the illuminated screen of my iPad, the color draining from his face as the sheer magnitude of the word embezzlement registered in his mind. He took a staggering, unsteady step away from my father, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as if he might be sick right there on my Persian rug. The muscular, exhausted contractor had spent the last 10 years breaking his back on construction sites, pouring concrete and framing houses to provide a good life for his wife. He had trusted his father-in-law, implicitly handing over a massive second mortgage to secure a family property. Now he was looking at undeniable digital proof that his blood sweat and literal tears had been funneled directly into a criminal enterprise. The younger police officer immediately unclipped his radio from his belt, stepping securely between Richard and the front door. The older officer pulled a thick notepad from his breast pocket, his eyes darting from my tablet to Richard's sweating, terrified face. I did not stumble across this information by accident. I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned, suffocating silence of the living room. I stepped away from the mahogany desk and walked directly toward my father, forcing him to shrink back against the wall. You always belittled my career, Dad. You spent my entire life telling everyone I was just a low-level paper pusher at a boring boutique firm. You told Vanessa I was a glorified secretary. You never actually bothered to ask what my legal specialty was. If you had, you might have been significantly smarter about hiding your tracks. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He just swallowed audibly, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door. I am a senior associate specializing entirely in corporate fraud and acquisitions. I stated, enunciating every single syllable with icy, uncompromising precision. My entire job revolves around dismantling fake corporate structures, tracing laundered money, and tracking hidden financial assets. For the past 8 months, my firm has been conducting a massive multi-million-dollar due diligence audit for a private equity group looking to acquire several regional manufacturing suppliers. Your primary company ended up on our desk for a routine evaluation. I tapped the screen of my tablet, expanding the highly detailed financial flowchart I had meticulously built over the past few weeks. I turned the device so the 2 police officers and Marcus could see it clearly. The older officer leaned in, his sharp eyes darting across the highlighted transactions, tracing the thick red lines that connected Richard's so-called legitimate business accounts to a labyrinth of illegal offshore entities. This was not a temporary cash flow issue, I explained, looking directly at Marcus, making sure he understood the absolute depths of the betrayal. Horizon Apex Ventures is just one of 7 dummy corporations Richard created to siphon capital out of his own manufacturing firm. Every single time Vanessa needed a new designer wardrobe, every time Brenda wanted to fly first class to Milan for a weekend shopping spree, Richard drained company resources and laundered them through these untraceable shell accounts. Your $150,000 hit that account and was immediately wire transferred to a bank in the Cayman Islands to cover a massive defaulted loan from some very dangerous people. Richard let out a pathetic, suffocating whimper, sliding further down the wall until his knees buckled. He covered his face with his trembling hands. I felt absolutely zero pity for the man. The worst part is not what you stole from Marcus, I said, my voice hardening into pure righteous fury. To keep your fraudulent lifestyle afloat, to keep paying for the luxury cars and the country club memberships to impress people who do not actually care about you, you needed more capital than the company was generating. So you emptied the employee pension funds. The younger police officer let out a sharp, audible gasp. Marcus clenched his large fists, his knuckles turning completely white. You stole the retirement savings of the factory workers who spent 30 years building your supposed empire, I stated, my gaze boring holes into my father. Those people trusted you with their futures, and you left them with absolutely nothing just so Brenda could buy more jewelry. The federal indictments are already being drafted by the Securities and Exchange Commission, Richard. You are not going to a minimum security white-collar resort. You are going to federal prison. Brenda could not handle it. The undeniable, documented proof of her impending poverty broke whatever fragile, delusional grip she still had on reality. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She clutched her obscenely expensive crocodile leather handbag to her chest like a protective shield, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You cannot prove any of this!" Brenda yelled, her voice cracking into a hysterical screech that forced the younger officer to step forward in warning. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide and wild. "You are making all of this up because you are a jealous, miserable liar. My husband is a respected CEO. We are pillars of this community. We have millions of dollars. I drive a brand new Porsche. We are not criminals." I looked at the frantic, pathetic woman who had spent my entire existence making me feel like an ugly, unworthy outcast. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The power dynamic had permanently shifted, and she was entirely powerless to stop it. I simply tilted my head, offering her a cold, empty smile. "You mean the white Porsche Cayenne with the custom leather interior and the license plate ending in 49B? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Brenda froze instantly. Her manicured finger slowly dropped to her side. Her mouth hung open in a silent gasp as the specific detail pierced through her hysterical denial. "That is funny." I continued, taking a slow step toward the antique bay windows at the front of the living room, because a repo tow truck just scanned that exact license plate in my driveway. "Look out the window, Brenda." Brenda practically tore the heavy velvet drapes off their brass rings as she threw herself against the antique bay window. The thick, insulated glass did nothing to muffle the heavy, unmistakable grinding of industrial gears echoing from my driveway. A massive flatbed tow truck with flashing amber lights was parked directly behind Brenda's pristine white Porsche Cayenne. The repo man, wearing a high-visibility neon vest and holding a heavy steel winch, was already securing the thick chains to the front axle of the luxury SUV. Brenda let out a sound that was less human and more like a dying animal. She spun around, her high heels tearing at the Persian rug, and sprinted for the heavy oak front door. She threw it open, stumbling down the brick steps and sprinting blindly across the manicured lawn. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she waved her arms frantically in the crisp afternoon air. "Stop what you are doing right now. That is my personal vehicle. You are making a massive mistake. I will sue you and your entire company into the ground." The older police officer did not miss a single beat. He followed her right out the front door, his hand resting casually but firmly on his utility belt. The repo man did not even pause his work. He simply glanced at Brenda, checked a clipboard resting on his dashboard, and hit a heavy rubber button on his control panel. The winch whirred loudly, dragging the incredibly expensive white car onto the tilted metal ramp with a jarring scrape. "I said stop, Brenda!" howled, lunging toward the operator with her manicured claws outstretched. The older officer stepped smoothly between Brenda and the tow truck, planting his body like an immovable brick wall. "Ma'am, you need to step back onto the grass immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying the absolute non-negotiable tone of a man who dealt with hysterical, entitled people for a living. "That vehicle is being legally repossessed by the bank due to months of severe non-payment. We ran the plates when we pulled up. If you interfere with this lawful recovery process, or if you touch that operator, I will arrest you for obstruction and place you in the back of my cruiser right now. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Brenda froze, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. The threat of actual physical arrest in front of my watching neighbors finally pierced through her delusion. She stood shivering on the lawn, clutching her designer bag to her chest, watching the flashing amber lights bounce off the immaculate paint of her ultimate status symbol as it was slowly dragged away into the street. Inside my living room, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of total defeat. With Brenda screaming outside and the harsh, undeniable reality of his financial crimes laid bare on my iPad screen, Richard finally gave up the ghost. The arrogant, posturing patriarch completely vanished. His knees literally buckled beneath him. He stumbled backward and sank heavily into my tufted leather armchair, the very chair he had tried to claim as his own just an hour earlier. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic, dry heaves. The bespoke Italian suit he wore suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like a cheap borrowed costume. The illusion of the powerful, untouchable CEO was entirely shattered. He was nothing but a desperate broke con man who had finally run out of runway. There were no more credit cards to max out, no more employees to steal from, and no more gullible family members to scam. The walls were rapidly closing in, and the federal indictments were waiting just around the corner. I walked slowly across the room and stood directly over him. I looked down at the top of his graying head, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The terrified little girl who used to beg for a scrap of his approval was completely dead and gone. "This is why you hated me, wasn't it?" I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. It was not a question. It was a cold, hard fact. Richard did not look up, but his shaking shoulders went perfectly still. "You hated me because I refused to play a part in your fake plastic life." I continued enunciating every word so it would carve itself permanently into his memory. "You built an entire existence on looking rich, on acting superior, on stepping on anyone who got in your way to maintain the hollow illusion of success." Brenda played the part of the wealthy socialite perfectly. Vanessa played the spoiled, oblivious princess perfectly. But I did not play along. I saw through you when I was 18 years old. I saw the bounced checks, the unpaid bills, the sheer exhausting panic behind your eyes every time the phone rang or a certified letter arrived in the mail. I took a step closer, forcing him to shrink further back against the leather upholstery. "I refused to let you control my future, so you punished me for it. You called me a failure. You called me an ugly, ungrateful disappointment. You kicked me out and told the rest of the extended family I was a lost cause just to protect your own fragile, pathetic ego. You tried to break me down so I would never be strong enough to expose you. But you failed, Richard. I built a real life with real success, and I used it to completely dismantle your fake one." Across the room, Vanessa stood completely paralyzed. She had just watched her mother humiliated on the front lawn and her father destroyed in the living room. Her guaranteed inheritance was a spectacular lie. Her parents were facing federal prison for embezzlement. The financial safety net she had relied on her entire life was entirely gone. Panicking, Vanessa turned to the only source of stability left in the room. She turned to Marcus. "Marcus," she sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand toward his muscular arm. Her voice took on that familiar, high-pitched, pleading tone she always used when she wanted to be rescued from her own massive messes. "Marcus, please. Take me home. I cannot be here anymore. Just take me home so we can fix this. Let us just go home." Marcus did not move a single muscle. He did not reach out to comfort her. He did not soften his rigid stance. He stood there like a statue carved from solid rock, looking at the woman he had married with utter, complete disgust. The absolute betrayal in his dark eyes was devastating to witness. The realization that she had willfully participated in draining his life savings to fund her parents' criminal vanity project had severed whatever bond they once shared. He dropped his hands from his sides, refusing to let her touch him, stepping back as if her proximity physically burned him. "I am going home, Vanessa," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, hollow whisper that carried more absolute finality than a scream. "You are going to a hotel." Vanessa let out a wavering, broken gasp. She wrapped her arms around her knees, curling into a tight ball on the floor as the reality of her shattered marriage finally set in. Marcus did not spare her a second glance. He turned away from the weeping woman and focused his entire imposing attention back on the man sitting in my armchair. Marcus crossed the room with heavy, deliberate steps. He planted his work boots squarely in front of Richard. He leaned forward, gripping both armrests of the tufted leather chair, effectively caging my father in. The physical difference between the two men was striking. Marcus was a broad-shouldered contractor who worked with his hands every day, while Richard was a soft, manicured executive who had never lifted anything heavier than a golf club. Right now, Richard looked entirely terrified. "I am not leaving this house until I get an answer," Marcus growled. His voice was dangerously calm, devoid of shouting, but laced with pure menace. I want to know exactly where my money went, Richard. Every single penny of that $150,000. Richard pressed his spine hard against the leather, his eyes darting frantically toward the two police officers standing a few feet away. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Marcus, please, Richard croaked, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. It is complicated. Corporate finance requires fluid capital. I just needed a bridge loan to get through the quarter. Do not lie to me again, Marcus barked, slamming a heavy fist against the armrest. The sudden violent noise made Richard jump out of his skin. Where is the money? Who did you send my life savings to? The older police officer stepped slightly forward, his hand resting on his radio. I suggest you answer the man, sir, the officer stated flatly. You are standing on the edge of a very steep cliff right now. The combined pressure of Marcus looming over him and the unblinking stares of armed law enforcement completely shattered Richard's remaining resolve. The suave, arrogant patriarch deflated like a punctured tire. His shoulders slumped, and a pathetic wet sob escaped his throat. I had to do it. Richard mumbled, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. I was drowning. The business accounts were empty. The suppliers stopped shipping materials months ago because we owed them millions. I tried to secure traditional loans, but the banks laughed at me. They saw my debt-to-income ratio and slammed the door in my face. Marcus leaned in closer, his jaw locked tight. So you went to non-traditional lenders? Richard squeezed his eyes shut and nodded miserably. Private capital, he whispered, though everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. Unregulated lenders, loan sharks, dangerous people who do not care about collateral, only about collection. I missed 3 payments, Marcus. They started showing up at the country club. They cornered me in the parking garage at my office. They told me if I did not wire them a massive lump sum by the end of the week, they were going to start visiting Vanessa. Marcus recoiled slightly, his face twisting with absolute disgust. You put your own daughter in danger, and then you stole my money to save your own skin. It was not stealing, Richard cried out, his eyes flying open in a desperate plea for understanding. It was a temporary solution. I had a plan. I just needed a fast injection of cash to keep them off my back. And the plan was stealing my house, I interjected, stepping out from behind my mahogany desk to join Marcus. I crossed my arms, looking down at the broken man who shared my DNA. You forged those eviction notices. You planned to kick me out onto the street, quickly flip Aunt Beatrice's property to a cash buyer, and use the proceeds to pay off your mob debts. You probably thought you could throw a little bit of that money back to Marcus later to keep him quiet. Richard looked at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. His silence was the loudest confession I had ever heard. I just needed time, he whimpered pitifully. The house was just sitting here. It was worth a fortune. It was the only asset left that was not mortgaged to the hilt. I thought I could clear the slate before anyone noticed. I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You truly are incredibly stupid, Richard. I turned my attention to the 2 police officers, gesturing clearly toward my father. Officers, you arrived here today to handle a simple squatter dispute because this man falsely claimed I was trespassing. But what you have just witnessed is something entirely different. The older officer nodded slowly, pulling a small notebook and pen from his breast pocket. He clicked the pen, his eyes fixed sharply on Richard. My specialty is corporate law. I continued, projecting my voice with absolute clinical authority. What my father just admitted to is not a simple misunderstanding. By confessing that he used a fake holding company to funnel money from his son-in-law to unregulated private lenders, he has explicitly admitted to wire fraud. By forging my aunt's signature and filing fake eviction papers with the city, he has confessed to felony forgery. And by attempting to illegally sell a property he does not own to cover those debts, he has openly admitted to conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud. The silence in the living room was absolute. The sheer weight of those federal and state charges hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Richard stared at me, his mouth hanging open in horror, as the legal reality of his pathetic confession finally registered. He had just handed a prosecutor everything they needed on a silver platter. The older police officer finished writing in his notebook, and slid it back into his pocket. He exchanged a brief, meaningful look with his younger partner. The younger officer nodded, stepping forward to flank the armchair. The older officer reached behind his back, unsnapping the leather pouch on his utility belt. The sharp, metallic clinking sound of steel handcuffs echoed clearly in the quiet room. "Richard Wilson," the officer said, his voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Richard let out a strangled gasp, pressing himself deeper into the chair, shaking his head in frantic denial. "No, no, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You do not understand. I am a respected man. You cannot do this." "I said stand up, sir," the officer commanded, his hand gripping Richard's bicep and hauling him upward with effortless strength. Richard stumbled to his feet, his shoulders shaking as the officer moved behind him. But before the cold steel cuffs could click shut around his wrists, a sudden violent crash echoed from the entryway. The heavy oak front door flew open, slamming against the plaster wall with bone-rattling force. Brenda stormed back inside the house, completely feral and absolutely unhinged. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess from the wind, her expensive makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and her eyes were burning with a frantic, destructive madness. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess from the wind. Her expensive makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and her eyes were burning with a frantic, destructive madness. The mechanical whining of the tow truck dragging away her ultimate status symbol had completely shattered her fragile psyche. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of untouchable wealth and superiority. That white Porsche was not just a luxury vehicle. It was her entire identity. It was her armor at the country club, her entry ticket into the exclusive charity luncheons, and her tangible proof that she was vastly superior to the working-class neighbors she constantly sneered at. Watching the repo man unceremoniously winch it onto a flatbed truck was the equivalent of watching her entire existence turn to ash. Her frantic, bloodshot eyes darted around the living room, skipping blindly over the armed police officers, ignoring her weeping golden child Vanessa, and completely disregarding her humiliated, broken husband. Her gaze locked entirely on me. In her twisted, delusional reality, she could not accept that her husband was a criminal or that she was complicit in his financial ruin. There had to be a villain, and I was the perfect target. I was the architect of her destruction. I was the ungrateful scapegoat who had finally refused to carry the heavy, suffocating burden of their lies. "You did this!" Brenda shrieked, the sound tearing violently through her throat. She stomped into the room, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You planned this from the very beginning. You malicious, jealous little monster. You could not stand seeing us happy. You could not stand that Vanessa had a beautiful life, and you had nothing. So you decided to destroy this family." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression as cold and unyielding as a glacier. "You destroyed yourselves, Brenda," I replied evenly, my voice slicing through her hysteria with surgical precision. "I just stopped paying the rent on your delusions." That was the final trigger. The cold, undeniable truth of my words stripped away her last remaining shred of self-control. Brenda let out a guttural scream of pure, unfiltered hatred. She dropped her designer handbag to the floor, the heavy clasps clattering against the hardwood, and charged at me. She crossed the distance between us in 3 frantic, stumbling strides. "You ungrateful little wretch!" she roared, pulling her right arm back. Her hand swung in a wide, vicious arc, aiming a full-force slap directly at my face. She wanted to punish me. She wanted to physically put me back in the submissive, terrified place I had occupied during my childhood. But I was no longer the frightened 18-year-old girl she used to terrorize. I saw the strike coming a mile away. Before her hand could even come close to my cheek, my left hand snapped up. I caught her wrist mid-air with bone-bruising force. The sudden impact stopped her momentum dead in its tracks. Brenda gasped in shock, her eyes widening as she stared at my fingers clamped like an industrial vice around her arm. I did not hesitate. I twisted her wrist sharply downward and outward, applying just enough concentrated pressure to the joint to send a white-hot flare of pain shooting up her arm. Brenda let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek. Her knees buckled slightly as she instinctively tried to pull away from the agonizing torque. I held on for one extra second, letting her feel the absolute futility of her physical attack before shoving her forcefully backward. Brenda stumbled clumsily on her high heels, her arms windmilling as she crashed back into the edge of the heavy oak coffee table. She hit the wood with a loud thud, gasping for air and cradling her sprained wrist against her chest, looking up at me with utter disbelief. Seeing his wife physically repelled was the exact spark needed to detonate the powder keg of Richard's shattered ego. For decades, he had ruled his household through fear, intimidation, and the absolute demand for total submission. Watching the daughter he despised effortlessly overpower his wife completely short-circuited his brain. The overwhelming narcissistic injury of being exposed as a fraud facing federal prison and now watching his authority physically dismantled in his own supposed home was simply too much for his fragile toxic pride to bear. He completely forgot about the older police officer holding the handcuffs directly behind him. He forgot the legal jeopardy that was already burying him alive. All he saw was red. Richard let out a primal, deafening roar. He violently twisted his shoulder, ripping his arm out of the older officer's preliminary grasp. The sudden explosive movement caught the officer off guard just long enough for Richard to break free. He launched himself away from the armchair, his heavy dress shoes pounding against the hardwood floor. His face was contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated violence. The veins in his neck were bulging, and a thick line of spittle flew from his lips as he charged directly at me. He pulled his right fist back, his knuckles white, aiming a devastating blow right at my head. "I should have destroyed you when I had the chance," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing with decades of suppressed violent hatred. The younger police officer shouted a warning, his hand flying to his utility belt, but Richard was moving too fast with blind, reckless momentum. I braced my feet against the floor, raising my arms to deflect the incoming strike, preparing for the heavy impact of his closed fist. But the impact never arrived. Before Richard could even get within striking distance of me, a massive blur of motion crossed my peripheral vision. A thick, muscular arm clad in a heavy denim work jacket shot out like a battering ram. The forearm intercepted Richard mid-air, catching him squarely across the collarbone and upper chest with the unstoppable force of a freight train. The brutal collision instantly stopped Richard's forward momentum, lifting his feet clean off the ground. The massive arm violently shoved forward, driving Richard backward across the room with breathtaking speed. With a sickening, thunderous crash, the arm slammed Richard hard against the drywall. The impact knocked the breath completely out of Richard in a violent, rattling wheeze. The heavy drywall cracked under his weight, sending a fine cloud of white gypsum dust raining down onto the shoulders of his ruined Italian suit. A framed landscape painting rattled off its hook and shattered violently on the hardwood floor beside them. Marcus did not back down a single inch. He stepped directly into the older man's personal space, pressing his heavy muscular forearm right against Richard's throat. He pinned my father so securely against the fractured wall that Richard's polished leather shoes barely brushed the ground. The manic, arrogant rage that had fueled Richard's attempted assault instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by wide, suffocating panic as he struggled uselessly against the younger man's iron grip. "You will never lay a hand on her or any woman while I am standing here," Marcus growled. His voice dropped to a dangerous, vibrating frequency that cut straight through the remaining chaos in the room. "Do you understand me?" Richard could only manage a pathetic, choking gasp, his manicured hands clawing weakly and ineffectively at the thick denim sleeve of Marcus's work jacket. The two police officers erupted into motion, their momentary shock at the sudden physical altercation instantly replaced by rote tactical training. The older officer grabbed Richard by the back of his expensive collar, ripping him away from Marcus's grip and throwing him face first onto the floor. "Stop resisting," the older officer barked, planting a heavy authoritative knee squarely into the center of Richard's spine. Richard let out a muffled, pathetic cry of pain as his arms were wrenched violently behind his back. The harsh, ratcheting sound of the steel handcuffs locking tightly into place echoed with absolute, undeniable finality. Simultaneously, the younger officer spun around and grabbed Brenda. She was still leaning heavily against the oak coffee table, clutching her sprained wrist, and staring at her husband's brutal takedown in sheer paralyzed disbelief. As the officer grabbed her uninjured arm, the shock evaporated entirely, and pure feral hysteria took over. "Get your hands off me!" Brenda screeched, thrashing wildly and attempting to kick the young officer in the shins with her pointed heels. "I am a victim here. She attacked me. You cannot arrest me. Do you have any idea who I am?" "Ma'am, you just attempted to assault a homeowner in our direct line of sight," the younger officer stated. His voice was completely devoid of emotion or sympathy as he effortlessly twisted her around. He slammed her chest against the nearest wall, pulled her arms back, and clamped a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. "You are under arrest for attempted assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent, and considering your current situation, I highly suggest you start using it immediately." The sheer volume of the noise in my living room was deafening. Brenda was howling at the ceiling, kicking at the air, and screaming for her expensive defense lawyer. Richard was groaning on the floor, his face pressed against the dusty wood, babbling incoherently about bridge loans, corporate misunderstandings, and his ruined reputation. Vanessa was curled into a tight, trembling ball in the corner, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her parents, her financial safety net, and her entire privileged reality completely disintegrate in front of her tear-filled eyes. Through it all, I remained standing in the exact same spot behind my mahogany desk. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I smoothed a slight crease in my tailored blouse and watched the absolute destruction of the toxic empire that had tried to crush me for 2 decades. I was completely unharmed, breathing evenly and feeling a profound, radiant sense of closure. The officers hauled Richard to his feet. His face was red and smeared with dust, the expensive fabric of his suit torn at the shoulder. They grabbed Brenda by the elbows, ignoring her high-pitched threats of lawsuits, and forcefully marched both of my parents toward the front door. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sound of Brenda's endless shrieks. The flashing amber lights of the tow truck had already vanished down the street. Now the blue and red lights of the police cruiser pulsed through my bay windows, casting erratic shadows over the wreckage of my living room. Silence finally settled over the house. It was heavy, thick, and incredibly cleansing. Marcus took a deep, steadying breath. He rolled his broad shoulders, releasing the adrenaline that had corded his muscles, and calmly straightened the collar of his denim jacket. He glanced down at Vanessa, who was still weeping on the floor, shaking his head with a look of profound, weary resignation. He stepped carefully over the shattered glass of the fallen picture frame and walked slowly toward my desk. He stopped a few feet away from me. The violent anger that had radiated from him just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, calculating intensity. He reached a calloused hand deep into the inner pocket of his heavy jacket. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a small metallic object, a heavy-duty encrypted USB drive. He held it out, resting it gently on the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I looked down at the drive, then up into his dark eyes. He did not look at me with the same condescension or dismissal my family had always used. He looked at me with deep, undeniable respect. He recognized me as an equal, a survivor who had just orchestrated the perfect surgical dismantling of a monster. I managed the physical assets and warehouse inventory for his corporate logistics division. Marcus stated, his voice steady and incredibly low. I have master keys to everything. I have access to the loading docks, the transport schedules, and the secure supply chain invoices. I found a massive discrepancy in the ledgers last month. Whole shipments of high-value electronics were being marked as damaged or lost in transit, but the inventory numbers did not match the insurance claims. He tapped a heavy, calloused finger against the metal casing of the USB drive. I dug deeper. Marcus continued, his gaze locking firmly onto mine. I bypassed the main corporate server and downloaded the raw data directly from the warehouse terminal. Shipping manifests, secret offshore holding accounts, fake supplier invoices. I had the absolute proof that he was bleeding the company dry and laundering the cash through shell corporations, but I did not know who to trust. I knew his reach in this city was too deep. I knew if I went to his corporate board, they would just bury the evidence and fire me to protect their stock prices. A small, grim smile touched the corner of Marcus's mouth. But you are a corporate lawyer, Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute, unwavering certainty. You just took down his entire personal life in 20 minutes. I think you know exactly what to do with this data to make sure he never sees the outside of a federal penitentiary again. I reached out and took the heavy metallic drive from his palm. The cold steel felt like a loaded weapon resting in my hand. I looked up at Marcus, seeing the unwavering resolve in his dark eyes. He had risked his own career, his own safety, and his own freedom to secure this explosive information. He had stepped out of the shadows of my father's toxic, manipulative empire and chosen to stand firmly on the right side of history. I nodded slowly, a silent, unbreakable promise passing between us. I knew exactly what to do. I turned away from the towering contractor and walked purposefully across the open floor plan of my home, moving from the chaotic living room toward the pristine marble of my kitchen counter. The heavy, frantic breathing of my parents echoed behind me. The two police officers had forced Richard and Brenda completely down onto the polished hardwood, aggressively securing them while they waited for the transport vehicles to arrive. Brenda was currently reduced to pathetic, hiccuping sobs, her expensive mascara-stained face pressed humiliatingly against the floorboards. Richard was kneeling awkwardly, his arms pinned tightly behind his back by the heavy steel handcuffs, his chest heaving violently as he struggled to catch his breath. I picked up my iPad from the kitchen counter, my movements calm, measured, and deliberate. I slipped the appropriate adapter into the charging port and firmly plugged in Marcus's encrypted drive. A password prompt immediately flashed onto the high-resolution screen. Marcus stepped up to the opposite side of the marble counter, leaned his muscular frame forward, and quietly typed in a complex alphanumeric string. He hit the enter key, and the digital vault sprang wide open. My eyes scanned the screen as hundreds of heavily encrypted folders populated in a matter of seconds. Marcus had not exaggerated in the slightest. He had captured the absolute, irrefutable smoking gun. I tapped into the primary corporate ledger files, watching as years of meticulously hidden financial crimes unspooled right in front of my eyes. It was a masterpiece of corporate deceit, and I was reading the playbook. Richard had been running a massive, systematic embezzlement ring right under the noses of his board of directors for the better part of a decade. I scrolled rapidly through pages of dummy corporations registered in obscure offshore tax havens. I found dozens of inflated shipping invoices, completely fabricated supplier contracts, and phantom employee payrolls that funneled millions into thin air. He had been bleeding his own company completely dry, laundering the stolen cash through a complex, dizzying web of shell companies, and funneling the illicit funds directly into his personal, untraceable accounts. This was exactly how he afforded the white Porsche that was currently sitting on a tow truck. This was exactly how he maintained the exclusive country club memberships, the bespoke Italian suits, the sprawling mansion, and the lavish performative vacations. It was all built on a crumbling foundation of spectacular brazen tax evasion and relentless, unmitigated money laundering. The sheer scale of the theft was utterly breathtaking. As a seasoned corporate attorney, I knew the federal sentencing guidelines by heart. Looking at the staggering dollar amounts transferring across the screen, I knew exactly what this meant for him. The financial thresholds he had crossed triggered mandatory minimums. It was a guaranteed 20 years in a federal penitentiary. From his humiliating position on the living room floor, Richard twisted his neck frantically. He strained against the older police officer's iron grip, his desperate, bulging eyes locking onto the glowing screen of my iPad. He saw the familiar, customized dashboard of his company's secure inventory software reflecting clearly in my glasses. He looked at Marcus standing calmly by my side, arms crossed, completely unfazed by the glare. The devastating reality of his total exposure finally hit my father with the force of a physical blow. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The last remnants of his furious, narcissistic rage vanished into thin air. It was replaced instantly by the pathetic, sniveling desperation of a cornered rat who realizes the trap has finally snapped shut. "Chloe, please!" Richard croaked, his voice cracking as he began to beg. He tried to crawl forward on his knees only to be shoved firmly back down onto the floorboards by the older police officer. Chloe, you cannot do this. You cannot turn that data over to the authorities. I am your father. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot send your own father to prison. Think about the family legacy. Think about what this will do to our name. I did not stop scrolling. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the screen, verifying the routing numbers of his illegal offshore accounts with cold professional detachment. Please, you have to listen to me. Richard shrieked, pure panic, pitching his voice into a hysterical, high-pitched whine. You do not understand the corporate landscape right now. We are in the middle of a massive, highly sensitive buyout. A huge global firm is looking to acquire my entire company by the end of the quarter. It is the only thing keeping the business afloat. If that financial data gets out to the public, the deal will completely collapse. They will pull out of the negotiations immediately. The federal regulators will step in. The board of directors will throw me to the wolves, and the company will be seized by the acquiring conglomerate for pennies on the dollar. They will absolutely ruin me, Chloe. They will strip away everything I have ever built and leave me with nothing. I finally stopped typing. I closed the master file, locked the iPad screen with a soft click, and carefully pulled the USB drive from the port. I gripped the small piece of metal tightly in my palm, feeling the satisfying weight of his total destruction resting right in my hand. I turned around and leaned back casually against the cool marble of the kitchen counter. I looked down at the man who had tormented me, belittled me, and tried to destroy my future for my entire life. He was kneeling in the dust of my home, securely handcuffed, legally ruined, and begging for mercy from the very daughter he had always treated like garbage. I offered him a chillingly serene smile. It was the kind of smile that promised absolute, inescapable destruction. "Oh, Dad," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet, tension-filled space. "You still do not get it, do you?" Richard blinked up at me, his chest heaving violently, a look of profound, terrified confusion washing over his gray, sweating face. "I did not just audit your company for fun," I continued, letting the cold, hard truth drop into the room like an anvil. "I do not just know about the pending buyout. I initiated it. I represent the acquiring conglomerate." The name Apex Holdings finally registered in his panicking brain. I watched the realization strike him like a physical blow to the chest. Apex Holdings was the massive, ruthless corporate entity that had been circling his failing logistics company like a pack of starving wolves for the past 6 months. They had been aggressively buying up his debt, poaching his top executives, and strategically suffocating his supply chains in a textbook hostile takeover. He had spent the last 2 quarters bleeding cash and breaking federal laws just to fight them off, completely unaware that the architect of his corporate destruction was the daughter he had kicked out of his house a decade ago. "I am the lead counsel assigned to structure the buyout for Apex Holdings," I stated, my voice echoing with icy authority. "I have been tracking your financial decline for over a year. I knew about your massive mounting debts. I knew about the fraudulent offshore accounts you were using to hide the company's remaining assets. My forensic accounting team mapped out the entire web of shell corporations you built to launder the stolen money. We had the smoke, Richard. We had the digital footprints and the suspicious routing numbers. I was just waiting for the final definitive piece of physical proof to execute the hostile takeover and trigger the federal indictments." I held up the metallic USB drive, letting it catch the harsh light of the police cruiser flashing through the window. "Marcus just handed it to me," I said, looking down at him with absolute, unyielding triumph. Richard let out a hollow, agonizing wheeze. He slumped forward against his handcuffs, his forehead resting on the dusty floorboards. He was completely broken. The company he had built his entire arrogant identity around was gone. His freedom was gone. His legacy was entirely obliterated. Across the room, the full weight of my words finally slammed into Vanessa. She had spent her entire life insulated in a bubble of stolen privilege. She had never worked a real job, never paid her own rent, and never faced a single consequence for her actions. Her entire identity was tied directly to her status as the wealthy, untouchable golden child of a powerful CEO. Now she was staring at the undeniable reality that the limitless bank account she had relied on was a criminal mirage. I watched her eyes dart wildly around the room as the pieces clicked together in her spoiled, entitled brain. The trust fund she assumed would fund her lavish lifestyle forever was completely empty, drained to pay off mobsters and loan sharks. The black credit cards she used to fund her endless designer shopping sprees were going to be declined by morning. The luxury hotel Marcus had just banished her to would require a deposit she could no longer afford. The country club memberships, the spa days, the high society luncheons, they were all evaporating into thin air. Her father was going to federal prison. Her mother was being booked for assault. And the sister she had mocked and belittled her entire life now controlled the absolute fate of their entire existence. Vanessa began to hyperventilate. Her flawless, expensive blowout was a tangled mess, and her designer clothes looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her total ruin. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was entirely alone and completely unequipped to survive in the real world. She had helped drain her husband's life savings to protect a fraudulent empire that had just been seized by my firm. She scrambled across the hardwood floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the shattered glass from the broken picture frame. She crawled toward me, her face pale and streaked with mascara, her breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. She stopped at my feet, grabbing the hem of my tailored trousers with trembling, desperate fingers. "Chloe, please," Vanessa sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "We are sisters. You cannot do this to us. You cannot turn that drive over to the police. They will take the house. They will take the cars. They will freeze all the accounts. Please, Chloe, I am begging you. Do not take everything from us. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing left." I did not step back. I did not offer her a comforting hand. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, pathetic woman clutching at my ankles. I felt no pity. I felt no sibling loyalty. The years of her smug condescension, her cruel jokes, and her eager participation in my emotional abuse had completely burned away any affection I might have once held for her. I looked at her blankly, my expression completely devoid of sympathy. "You had a good husband," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing with cold, lethal precision, "but you chose to steal from him instead." Richard stared at me, his jaw slack, his eyes hollow and completely uncomprehending. The air left his lungs in a ragged, whistling wheeze. For a man who had built his entire existence on being the smartest, most ruthless person in any room, the realization that his discarded daughter had outmaneuvered him on a multi-million-dollar corporate battlefield completely short-circuited his brain. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. He simply kneeled there in the dust, the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my iPad. I opened my secure encrypted corporate email client. The interface loaded instantly, a stark clinical white screen that stood in sharp contrast to the emotional wreckage littering my living room floor. I tapped the screen, opening a new message draft. "What are you doing?" Richard suddenly gasped. His voice trembled with a terrifying, absolute certainty of what was coming next. "Chloe, wait. We can negotiate this. I can give you shares. I can make you a partner. You want equity. I will sign it over right now. Just put the tablet down." I ignored his frantic, pathetic bargaining. I tapped the attachment icon and selected the master file Marcus had just liberated from the warehouse terminal. The progress bar flashed onto the screen, filling rapidly with a bright green line as gigabytes of raw, unfiltered financial crimes were uploaded to the secure server. Offshore account routing numbers, falsified shipping manifests, dummy corporation charters, and years of blatant tax evasion data seamlessly attached themselves to my draft. It was a perfectly organized digital autopsy of a criminal enterprise. "You are making a terrible mistake!" Brenda shrieked from her position against the wall. She was still pinned there by the younger police officer, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. You are destroying your own family. You will be a pariah. No one in our social circle will ever speak to you again. You are throwing away our legacy." I did not even bother looking up at her. Her social circle was a decaying mirage built on stolen money, and it was about to evaporate completely. I tapped the recipient line and began to type. First, I addressed the email to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Next, I added the direct contact for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime unit, ensuring the lead investigators would wake up to a perfectly packaged, irrefutable slam-dunk case. Finally, I added the private email addresses of the entire board of directors at Apex Holdings. They needed to know immediately that the company they were currently attempting to acquire was nothing more than a hollow, rotting shell, and that the CEO they had been negotiating with was a brazen, desperate felon. I typed a brief clinical subject line: evidence of systemic embezzlement and fraudulent accounting practices. Richard saw the reflection of the email draft in my glasses. He lurched forward, straining violently against the grip of the older police officer. The officer instantly drove his knee harder into Richard's spine, pinning him flat against the hardwood floor with a sharp, warning grunt. Richard did not care. The panic had completely consumed him. "Chloe, no," he screamed, his voice tearing at his vocal cords, echoing off the high ceilings of my foyer. "Please, I will give you anything. I will step down. I will hand the company over to you. Just hit delete. Do not send that. They will seize everything. I will die in federal prison. Please, Chloe. I am your father." I looked down at the man who had spent my entire childhood making me feel small, worthless, and entirely dependent on his conditional approval. I looked at the mother who had enabled his cruelty, and the sister who had happily fed off the scraps of his stolen wealth. For the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for them. No fear, no obligation, no lingering desire for their toxic validation. I was entirely, completely free. I raised my index finger, hovering it directly over the glowing blue send button on the screen. There, I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling calm: "Your pension, your shares, your reputation, they are officially gone. You are walking out of here with exactly what you gave me when I was 18. Nothing." I tapped the screen. A small, satisfying whoosh sound echoed from the tablet speakers. The email vanished from the screen, instantly rocketing across secure servers and landing directly into the inboxes of federal prosecutors and corporate titans. The digital execution was flawless, irreversible, and absolutely final. "No," Richard wailed, dropping his head to the floor and sobbing into the dust. He wept with the loud, ugly, unrestrained terror of a man who knows his life is completely and utterly over. The two police officers, having stood in stunned silence while witnessing the most efficient, brutal corporate takedown imaginable, snapped back to reality. The corporate execution was complete, and now the physical arrests needed to be finalized. The older officer grabbed Richard by the collar of his ruined Italian suit and hauled him roughly to his feet. The younger officer mirrored the motion, jerking Brenda up by her arms and pulling her away from the wall. Richard stood trembling, his legs barely able to support his own weight. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated devastation. Brenda sagged against the younger officer, her manicured hands bound tightly behind her back, staring at me as if I had just morphed into an unrecognizable monster. Vanessa remained curled on the floor, weeping silently into her hands, completely paralyzed by the sudden absolute destruction of her privileged world. Richard Vance, the older officer, barked, his voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through the whimpering sounds of my parents. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" Richard did not answer. He just stared blankly at the floor, his jaw hanging open, his entire reality crumbling around him in real time. The officers did not wait for a verbal response. They gripped my parents firmly by the arms and began marching them toward the front door of my house, propelling them toward the waiting squad cars and the terrifying reality of a holding cell. As Richard was forcefully guided past the marble kitchen island, a sharp, piercing sound suddenly shattered the heavy silence in the room. It was a cell phone resting right on the edge of the counter. It was Richard's phone. The custom ringtone was loud, urgent, and unrelenting. The bright screen illuminated the dark kitchen, flashing rapidly with incoming alerts. The caller ID was displayed in bold, undeniable letters. Chairman of the board. The automated corporate alerts had already triggered. The massive data dump had been received and opened. The news of his monumental fraud had officially hit the highest levels of executive leadership at Apex Holdings, and the fallout was instantaneous. The phone continued to ring incessantly, a shrill, deafening alarm, signaling the absolute end of Richard's empire as the officers dragged him out of my house and into the cold night. The heavy oak door stood wide open, letting the crisp night air cut through the stagnant, dust-filled living room. I stepped out onto the front porch, the incessant ringing of Richard's abandoned cell phone fading behind me. I stood with my arms crossed over my chest and watched the officers march my parents down the perfectly manicured walkway. The flashing blue and red lights of the cruisers illuminated the entire cul-de-sac, painting the pristine suburban lawns in harsh, frantic strokes of color. Doors opened up and down the street. Heavy curtains twitched aside. The neighbors, the exact same high society people Brenda had spent her entire adult life trying to impress, dominate and outshine, were now standing on their front porches in their evening wear and pajamas. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the self-proclaimed king and queen of the country club were forced into the back of separate police vehicles. Brenda tried desperately to hide her face behind her bound hands, weeping hysterically as the younger officer guided her forward. Her designer dress was ruined, completely smeared with white drywall dust, and her carefully curated image of untouchable superiority was shattered forever. The women she used to mock at charity luncheons were now witnessing her ultimate, undeniable humiliation. Richard looked completely hollowed out. He did not fight. He did not argue. He simply stared blankly at the asphalt as the older officer pushed his head down to clear the doorframe of the cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut with a metallic thud. The engines revved loudly. The cruisers pulled away from the curb, taking the toxic architects of my childhood misery away in total public disgrace. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 2 decades finally lift off my shoulders. I turned around and walked back inside my home. Inside the foyer, the silence was absolute, broken only by the pathetic, ragged gasping coming from the floor. Vanessa was still on her hands and knees right where I had left her. The realization that she was completely ruined had finally taken full hold of her fragile, entitled mind. She had actively participated in the embezzlement. She had secretly drained her own husband's savings accounts to cover her father's margin calls, desperately trying to maintain her luxury lifestyle and keep the illusion alive. She looked up, her tear-streaked face, a mask of pure desperation, seeking any possible lifeline. She looked past my tailored trousers and locked eyes with Marcus. He stood near the kitchen island, his massive, muscular frame perfectly still. His dark eyes looked down at her with a cold, terrifying emptiness. The man who had loved her, who had worked brutally long hours managing warehouses to provide for her, now saw her exactly for what she was. A parasite. A thief who had sacrificed his financial security to protect a criminal empire. Marcus did not yell. He did not lose his temper. He simply raised his left hand. He grasped the thick gold wedding band on his ring finger and slowly, deliberately twisted it off. The metal made a soft, scratching sound against his knuckle. Vanessa let out a strangled, breathless cry, reaching one trembling, manicured hand out toward him. She knew exactly what that gesture meant. Her trust fund was gone. Her shopping sprees were over. Her entire identity, tied to a company that I now effectively controlled the fate of, was completely obliterated. Marcus ignored her outstretched hand completely. He stepped away from the scattered drywall dust, walked over to the marble counter, and placed the gold ring precisely next to my empty espresso cup. The soft clink of the heavy metal hitting the stone sounded louder than a gunshot in the quiet house. Vanessa scrambled forward, her fingers clawing helplessly at the hardwood floor. "Marcus, please!" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry. I can explain the transfers. I can fix this. Please do not leave me here." Marcus looked down at her, his expression harder than granite. "My lawyer will contact you tomorrow, Vanessa," he stated. His voice was completely devoid of any affection, anger, or warmth. It was a flat, businesslike declaration of facts. Do not call me. Do not text me. You are dead to me. Vanessa collapsed, completely burying her face in her arms and wailing into the floorboards. She had nothing. She had absolutely nothing left, and she had no one to blame but herself. Marcus turned away from the wreckage of his marriage and looked directly at me. The shared understanding between us was profound. We had both been used, manipulated, and discarded by the exact same people. We had both chosen to stand up, fight back, and reclaim our lives. He gave me a slow, deep nod of profound respect. Thank you, Chloe, he said softly, his voice carrying a heavy but liberated weight, for opening my eyes. I nodded back, acknowledging his strength. He turned around and walked out the front door, stepping out into the cool, liberating night air without looking back a single time. He strode down the driveway, his posture straight, completely unburdened by the toxic family he was leaving behind. As he reached the sidewalk, he walked right past the massive moving truck that had been idling at the curb for the last hour. The heavy diesel engine hummed loudly in the quiet neighborhood. The head mover, a burly man holding a battered clipboard, watched Marcus leave before turning his attention to my open front door. He jogged up the porch steps, his heavy boots thudding against the wood, and leaned his head into the foyer. He looked at the drywall dust, the shattered picture frame, and the weeping woman curled up on the floor. He blinked, clearly confused by the absolute chaos he had just walked into. Lady, the mover asked, scratching the back of his neck with his pen. Are we still moving stuff in or what? I looked down at my sister, taking in the full, magnificent reality of my absolute victory. I offered the mover a bright, genuine smile. No, I replied cheerfully, but there is a sobbing woman on the floor who needs a ride to a cheap motel. The head mover let out a harsh, barking laugh, clearly amused by the sheer ruthlessness of the situation. He nodded, stepped into the foyer, and gestured over his shoulder. Two burly men in matching gray uniforms flanked Vanessa. She was entirely devoid of fight now. Fighting requires energy, and her energy had been entirely drained along with her bank accounts, her social standing, and her marriage. They practically had to lift her by the armpits to get her moving. She dragged her feet, her ruined designer shoes, leaving faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor. She did not look back at me. She did not say another word. I stood in the foyer, listening to the heavy diesel engine of the moving truck shift into gear and rumble down the street, taking the absolute last remnant of my toxic family away from my home. I stepped forward and grasped the brass handle of the front door. I pushed it firmly shut, sealing out the cool night air and the flashing lights of the police cruisers that were currently hauling my parents to a federal holding facility. I reached up and turned the heavy deadbolt. The lock slid into place with a loud, metallic, and incredibly satisfying click. The silence that immediately followed was absolute. It was not an empty, lonely silence. It was a heavy, rich, beautiful silence. It was the distinct sound of total victory. I turned around and began walking through my perfectly curated home. The drywall dust in the foyer would need to be cleaned by my housekeeper tomorrow, but right now, I did not care. I walked past the marble kitchen island, where Marcus had left his wedding ring, resting permanently against the stone. I walked past the exact spot where my father had collapsed in handcuffs, begging for a mercy he never once afforded me. I walked past the wall where my mother had wailed about her ruined social standing, mourning her country club membership, while ignoring the fact that her husband was a criminal. I entered my study, the quiet sanctuary where I had spent countless late nights, meticulously mapping out the hostile takeover of Richard's fraudulent empire. On the polished oak desk sat a framed photograph of grandmother Beatrice. I picked it up, tracing the edge of the silver frame with my thumb. She was the only person in that entire genetic bloodline who ever saw my actual potential, the only one who believed I was capable of greatness without needing to be manipulated or controlled. I looked at her stern, loving face and searched myself for any lingering trace of familial guilt. I found absolutely none. I felt no remorse for orchestrating my father's federal indictment. I felt no pity for stripping my sister of her stolen, unearned wealth or exposing her financial betrayal to her husband. What I felt was the profound, lightweight peace of a highly skilled surgeon who had just successfully excised a massive malignant tumor. The sickness had been completely removed from my life, cut out at the root. I walked over to the small mirrored bar cart nestled in the corner of the study. I picked up a heavy crystal glass and a bottle of expensive, perfectly aged red wine. I poured myself a generous measure, watching the dark liquid swirl and catch the soft, warm light of the desk lamp. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was complex, rich, and incredibly grounding. I carried the glass to the large bay window overlooking the backyard. The moon cast long, silvery shadows across the manicured lawn. I leaned against the window frame and let my mind wander back over the grueling, relentless years that had led to this exact moment. I thought about the scared, broke 18-year-old girl who was thrown out onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes and a head full of vicious, targeted insults. My parents had actively designed a narrative where I was the eternal loser, the designated scapegoat destined for a life of mediocrity and failure. They actively worked to break my spirit, entirely confident that I would eventually crawl back to them begging for financial scraps and emotional validation. They completely underestimated my resilience. They never accounted for the sheer unyielding power of a woman who decides to channel her pain into pure, calculated ambition. Every late-night study session, every brutal corporate negotiation, every strategic investment was a concrete brick in the fortress I was building for myself. For over a decade, I operated in the shadows. I watched from afar as Richard paraded around the financial district, expanding his logistics company through fraudulent mergers and illegal kickbacks. I watched Brenda host her lavish charity galas wearing diamonds purchased with embezzled funds. I watched Vanessa leverage her last name to secure a hardworking husband she never truly respected. They lived in a glittering, precarious glass house, completely unaware that I was the one slowly, methodically removing the foundation stones one by one. I did not just survive their abuse. I weaponized it. I turned their greed, their arrogance, and their blatant disregard for the law into the exact tools I needed to orchestrate their total destruction. I now held the absolute, undeniable power over my own life and destiny. The corporate empire my father built to torment people now belonged to the daughter he discarded. The wealth my sister flaunted to make me feel small was now frozen by federal investigators under my direct instruction. They say blood is thicker than water, but I say the law is thicker than blood. They tried to break me, but all they did was forge a woman who knows exactly how to build a cage around her monsters. Have you ever had to use your success to obliterate the people who tried to destroy you? Tell me your story in the comments, because trust me, nothing tastes sweeter than a revenge served legally coldly and on your own property. The most powerful lesson to learn here is that family should never equate to blind loyalty, especially when rooted in abuse. This story teaches us that our true worth is not defined by those who constantly belittle us. Instead of crumbling under a family's cruelty, you can channel that pain into silent, unyielding ambition. Building your own empire and walking away from their toxic shadow is the ultimate victory. True security comes from financial and emotional independence, proving that the absolute best revenge is simply outgrowing your abusers. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.